Hello and welcome to the Daily Brief Show. I'm your host Anurag Bansal. Today is Thursday, the 12th of September, and I have four interesting stories for you. By the way, today's episode is a little different. I'm talking about two big global stories that could have implications on India and the rest of the world. And since we're only experimenting with this, I really wanted to know your thoughts on it. So do give it a watch on YouTube and also hear it on Spotify and let me know your thoughts in the comments. In the first story today, I'll talk about the US elections and what is really happening there. In the second story, I'll talk about India's growing consumption story. In the third one, I'll talk about a new antitrust case against Google, which could heavily impact many companies in India. And in the fourth one, I'll talk about how India is benefiting from iPhone 16. The US elections is just 55 days away, and after the recent debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, a lot of things are becoming clearer about what a potential Trump or Harris victory might mean for the US and around the world. But first, let me give you a quick update on the polls. Kamala Harris is up right now by a slim 2-point margin nationally, but it is neck to neck in critical swing states. This margin of error means Trump could still be ahead in some key areas, especially given the serious errors in polls in 2016 and 2020 elections. But with that out of the way, let me give you some context about the impacts of this, starting with the US economy. Now, first, a Trump victory could mean a pivot back to aggressive fiscal and trade policies, which could affect the US economy. Trump has said that he will impose a universal 10% tariff on all imports and a 60% tariff on all goods from China. Now, while Trump argues that this will bring manufacturing back home, the reality, according to Moody's, is a potential recession by mid-2025, with higher inflation hitting consumers directly. Now, the average American household could face an additional $1,700 in costs due to these tariffs, which are effectively a tax on imported goods if you think about it. US inflation will then ripple out across the world as well and also impact countries like India. Kamala Harris, in contrast, is expected to build up on Joe Biden's current policies with some tweaks aimed at reducing economic inequality and addressing cost of living pressures. She plans to increase corporate taxes to 28% and push for more affordable housing. In the global context, the difference in the positions of Trump and Harris are like night and day. Trump's tariff-heavy strategy could restart trade wars, not just with China, but potentially affecting allies in Europe and Asia as well. According to an analysis by ING, Trump's policy will put significant pressure on global supply chains, slow economic growth, and drive up inflation worldwide. This will eventually ripple out across poor and emerging economies who tend to rely heavily on exports, especially commodities. Now, emerging markets like India, which are heavily integrated into global trade networks, could also face currency pressures and slower growth as export demands weaken. Now, Harris, on the other hand, would likely continue on Biden's multilateral approach and avoid the kind of economic isolation that Trump's policy could bring in. Now, while her position on China remains firm, it may not be like Trump's. She might try to counterbalance China's influence rather than outright economic warfare. This approach could provide a more stable global economic environment and reduce the risk of the sudden shocks that characterized Trump's first presidential term. For the markets, the implications of a Trump presidency are going to be mixed. According to ING, while Trump's policies might initially boost the dollar due to his trade disruptions, it could eventually lead to a flight to safe assets like gold. Stocks could see gains in certain sectors due to deregulation and tax cuts, but the overall market could be dampened by increased trade tensions and higher consumer costs. But under Harris, on the other hand, the dollar might weaken slightly due to tighter fiscal policies, but her focus on infrastructure and social programs could provide some steady support for equities, particularly in sectors like technology and renewable energy. The bonds market might benefit from more predictable fiscal paths as investors look for more stability amidst political shifts. Geopolitically speaking, a Trump victory could bring significant changes, especially with regards to Ukraine. Trump has said that he wants to reduce support to Ukraine in its conflict with Russia, which could weaken US commitment to NATO and embolden Russia's position. If US stops supporting Ukraine, the region will become more destabilized and will alter the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Harris, on the other hand, will likely continue the current US support for Ukraine and will maintain sanctions on Russia and provide continued military aid, offering more consistent and stable approach to Eastern European security. But beyond Ukraine, Trump's Trump's broader America First approach will lead to heightened tensions globally. This could increase the risk of conflicts not just economically but also in terms of military. European allies already feel disillusioned from Trump's first term, and they might find themselves in a bit of a tricky position when it comes to defense and trade partnerships with the US. Harris will likely maintain a collaborative approach to geopolitics and will work closely with allies to counterbalance China and other global challenges. Now, this will provide a more stable geopolitical environment, though it will not eliminate the ongoing strategic competition for technological and economic dominance. Finally, on trade, Trump's tariff heavy approach aims to force manufacturing back to the US, but it is a high risk strategy. While the goal is to boost domestic jobs, the reality is that past tariffs have led to higher prices for consumers and little evidence of significant job growth in manufacturing. Trade partners, particularly in Europe and Asia, could retaliate, which could lead to a fragmented global trading system and reduced cooperation. Harris is expected to continue a multilateral trade policy which aims to strengthen relationships rather than isolate the US. She focuses more on reshoring through incentives rather than tariffs, which could lead to a more collaborative global trade environment without the immediate shocks associated with Trump's approach. All in all, in summary, Trump's economic strategy is a high risk potential for significant market volatility, higher inflation, and disrupted global trade. Harris, on the other hand, offers a more steady approach with targeted reforms aimed at making the economy more equitable. So let's see how things play out on the election day and how it impacts the world. Moving on to the second story, let's talk about how India's consumption story is changing. See, 10 years ago, the typical Indian meal looked very different from what we see today. Back then, cereals dominated and took up a significant portion of both the plate and the household budget. Fast forward to today, we are witnessing a remarkable transformation in what India eats. For the first time in modern India's history, families are spending less than half their income on food. And this is not because we are eating less. In fact, we are far from that. This is a sign of economic progress, with rural food expenditure increasing by 164% and urban by 146% in the past decade. The share of cereals in food expenditure has plummeted from about 10.7 to 4.9% in rural areas and from 6.6% to 3.6% in urban areas. But this dramatic drop does not necessarily mean that Indians are eating fewer cereals. A significant factor behind this decline is the impact of government food security schemes. Programs like the Public Distribution System or PDS have been providing free and subsidized grains to millions of low income households. This has substantially reduced out of pocket expenditure on cereals, particularly for the poorest families. For instance, the bottom 20% of households have seen the most substantial decrease in cereal expenditure today. In rural areas, it has dropped from 22% to 14.5% of their food budget. This reduction in cereal costs has freed up household budgets to diversify their diets. We're seeing fruits, vegetables, milks, eggs, and meat making their way into Indian plates across the country. For families in the bottom 20% of the income bracket, fresh fruit consumption has increased substantially. Milk, which once used to be a luxury for many, has now become more common. This shift has demonstrated how government food security policies, along with rising incomes, are not just ensuring basic nutrition, but are also enabling diverse diets. Now, improved infrastructure has also played a big role in these changes. Better roads, better storage facilities, and transportation systems have made fresh food available all year round, even in the most remote corners of the country. The concept of seasonal eating is also becoming a thing of the past. Now, this dietary diversification is not just changing what is on the plate, it is also improving health outcomes. Increased dietary diversity is associated with 14% lower prevalence of anemia in children and women. But this nutritional transition does not come without any challenges. As traditional staples are giving way to more varied diets, we are seeing a drop in cereal consumption across all groups. While this makes room for more nutrient-dense foods, it also requires rethinking of agricultural policies that have long focused on cereal production in India. Also, the rise of modern lifestyles has brought new problems. Consumption of packaged and processed foods, which is often high in sugar, salt, and unhealthy fats, is rising quite fast, particularly in urban areas of the country. At the same time, there has been a slight drop in vegetable consumption. Even more concerning is the increase in spending on tobacco and alcohol. The share of household expenditure on pan, tobacco, and intoxicants has risen in rural areas. To put this into some perspective, a typical rural household in 2022-23 spent more on these items than on fresh fruits. It is similar in urban areas as well. On one hand, we see positive shifts towards more diverse and nutritious diets, particularly among lower income groups. But on the other hand, there is a rise in consumption of processed foods, alcohol, and tobacco, which brings a big point of concern. Now, all of these changes that we're seeing on India's plates have big implications. They are reshaping agriculture, influencing public health policies, and reflecting broader economic shifts. While our nation continues to grow and evolve, so does its relationship with food. This decade of change tells a story of progress. Diets have become more varied and nutritious across all sections of society, but it also highlights new challenges that require innovative and new solutions. From policymakers to farmers, from food manufacturers to consumers, everyone has a big role to play in shaping the future of India's food landscape. Moving on to the third story of the day, let's talk about Google's new antitrust case, which could impact businesses very heavily. See, over the past 2 decades, we've witnessed the rise of tech giants that have come to dominate not just in their industry, but also in our daily lives. Let me put their size into some perspective to give you an idea. In May 2012, when Facebook IPO'd, the total market cap of Facebook, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft put together was 1.3 trillion US dollars. Today, it is 11 trillion US dollars. For your comparison, the total market cap of the overall Indian stock market is just 5 trillion US dollars. Now, these tech companies have achieved their dominance through a combination of innovative products, network effects, and strategic acquisitions. They've reshaped industries, created new ones, and have become gatekeepers of the digital economy today. But with great power comes great scrutiny, and these tech giants today are facing some big challenges from regulators and lawmakers around the entire world. The latest challenge is the antitrust case against Google, which began its trial on September 9th. But before I dive into the details, let me take a moment to explain why this even matters to you. Look, the dominance of big tech companies has big implications. First, many small businesses, including startups, rely on platforms like Google and Facebook for advertising. If these platforms are given too much power, they can potentially squeeze smaller businesses with higher fees and could spoil innovation and competition. Second, when a few companies dominate the overall market, consumers may have fewer options and companies could have less incentives to innovate or improve their services. Third, these companies collect vast amounts of user data. The concentration of so much personal information in the hands of a few corporations raises very big privacy concerns. Fourth, social media platforms have become a major source of news and information today. These algorithms could potentially influence the information that people like you and I see every day, and they could also affect public opinion and even election outcomes. Fifth, the concentration of wealth and power in a handful of tech companies can lead to economic inequality and reduced competition in the broader economy. Now, with those points out of the way, let me explain what Google's exact case is. See, at its core, the US Department of Justice claims that Google has created a monopoly in the digital advertising market. They argue that Google has built what they call the trifecta of monopolies in the ad tech space. According to them, Google dominates the tools used by website publishers to sell ad spaces, the tools used by advertisers to buy that ad space, and the advertising exchange where these transactions happen. It's a bit like if a single company owned the entire New York Stock Exchange, the largest brokerage firms, and the softwares that investors use in order to trade stocks. Now, the DOJ argues that this level of vertical integration gives Google an unfair advantage and allows them to manipulate the digital advertising market at every stage of a transaction. In her opening statement, a DOJ lawyer accused Google of using its dominance to control all sides of the markets. And she said this is leading to higher prices for advertisers, less revenue for publishers, and ultimately harm to consumers. Now, one particularly interesting aspect of this case is DOJ's focus on Google's past acquisitions. DOJ points to purchases like DoubleClick in 2008 as strategic moves to eliminate potential competitors. Now, the government also alleges that Google has used some very clever tactics to maintain its dominance. For instance, they claim Google limited the interoperability of its ad tools with rival systems, and this has made it hard for advertisers and publishers to use anything apart from Google's products. They call it the classic walled garden strategy. Perhaps most controversially, though, the DOJ accuses Google of manipulating ad auctions to favor its own exchange. But Google, on the other hand, sees things a little differently. Google argues that the digital ad market is fiercely competitive right now, with players like Amazon and Meta gaining significant market share. Google's lawyers say that the company's success is due to the superior quality of its products and not any anti-competitive behavior. Google's defense team is likely to argue that the DOJ's view of the market is outdated, stuck in a pre-smartphone and social media world. They'll probably point to emerging sectors like connected TV advertising and retail media to show how dynamic and competitive the digital ad landscape really is. Now, this trial comes after another significant legal setback for Google, by the way. Just last month, US District Judge Amit Mehta ruled that Google had illegally monopolized the online search market. The judge found that Google's practice of paying billions of dollars to device makers and browsers to be the default search engine violated antitrust laws. Judge Mehta's ruling, in a way, was unequivocal. He called Google a monopolist and he said that it had acted as one to maintain its monopoly. Now, this decision was a major victory for the DOJ and it could lead to substantial changes in how Google operates its core search business. Now, it is worth noting that these cases against Google are a part of a broader trend of increased scrutiny on big tech. We are seeing a remarkable shift in how these companies are perceived today. Just a few years ago, companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, and Meta were often looked at as innovative disruptors, but now they are increasingly viewed as incumbents using their market power to maintain their dominance. Now, this shift in sentiment is not confined to the US alone. Globally, also, we're seeing something very similar. The European Union has been particularly proactive here, and they have implemented sweeping regulations like the Digital Markets Act and the General Data Protection Regulation. These rules aim to reduce the power of tech giants and enhance users' privacy. Now, the US, by contrast, has leaned more heavily on antitrust enforcement and has brought cases against individual companies rather than implementing broad new regulations. This is an approach that is more in line with America's traditionally market-oriented philosophy. Now, meanwhile, other countries like China have taken a more direct approach to this. They have exercised significant control over their tech sector. The crackdown on companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and others in 2023 demonstrates China's willingness to intervene forcefully in its tech industry. Now, as we watch these legal and regulatory battles unfold, we can look to history to get a sense of how things might turn out. The current situation with big tech has often been compared to the landmark antitrust case against Standard Oil in the early 20th century. Standard Oil was owned by John D. Rockefeller and controlled over 90% of US oil production and sales. Now, this Standard Oil case was noteworthy because it was forced to break up into 34 smaller companies, which would later become Exxon and Chevron. This breakup was designed to restore competition to the oil industry, which had been dominated by Standard Oil's monopoly. A more recent comparison is the Microsoft antitrust case of the 1990s. Microsoft was accused of using its dominance in the operating system market to squeeze out competition in the browser market. Microsoft was bundling its Internet Explorer browser with its Windows operating system, which was installed on the vast majority of personal computers. Now, this made it very difficult for rival browsers like Netscape to compete. Microsoft was then forced to share its APIs with third-party companies and was prohibited from entering into agreements compelling third parties to exclusively distribute or promote Internet Explorer. So, what are the potential implications in these cases? See, if Google loses, we could see major changes in how online advertising and search operates. This could potentially lead to more competition and innovation in these spaces. For instance, we might see new players emerging in the search market or more diversity in online advertising platforms. For consumers, on the other hand, this impact might be less immediately visible but potentially much higher. More competition could lead to better products and services and possibly lower prices for advertisers, and this could indirectly benefit consumers. However, it's also possible that breaking up Google's integrated services could lead to a less seamless user experience. But all said and done, it is very important to note that these cases are very complicated in nature and they could eventually take many years to fully resolve. Now, moving on to the fourth and the final story of the day, let's talk about how India is heavily benefiting from iPhone 16. Look, I'm sure by now you might know that Apple recently launched the iPhone 16, but the big news right now is about where these phones are being manufactured. For many years, China has been Apple's go-to manufacturing hub for the latest models of iPhones, but things are now changing quite fast. Foxconn has been busy assembling the iPhone 16 in India, and these assembled in India products will very soon hit global shelves. And this is a big deal for us because manufacturing has often been the route that most developed countries have taken in order to create jobs and boost their economic growth. We witnessed a live example of this between 1960s and 1990s with the Asian Tigers, that is Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. They invested heavily in manufacturing and became export powerhouses. So yes, more manufacturing in India is definitely good. But what exactly is Apple doing in India? Let me give you some numbers. See, 14% of all iPhones are now assembled in India, and this is up from just 7% in the previous year. According to Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal, this number is expected to hit 25% by 2025. Now, these are bold claims, but considering we got to 14%, 25% does not seem too far-fetched. To give you some history of Apple and India's relation, Apple started its manufacturing journey in India back in 2017 by making older iPhone models. The newer models were still coming from China, but now Apple's goal is very simple. It is to diversify away from China. Apple has two big reasons for it. First is politics. See, US-China relations have steadily deteriorated since 2016 when Trump became the president. In fact, bringing back manufacturing jobs from China that they supposedly stole was a key part of Trump's manifesto. As Trump started a trade war with China, Apple started looking outside of China to diversify its supply chain. Estimated that Apple suppliers have spent around 16 billion US dollars on diversifying production assets away from China to India, Mexico, US, and Vietnam since 2018. But it is mostly about their economics. See, the pandemic exposed the risk of concentrated supply chains in China. COVID led to the shutdown of Apple's key factories in China, and it led to major delays and left consumers waiting for weeks for their iPhones. Apple didn't want that to happen again. But there is more to it than just supply chain headaches. By 2021, Apple began producing newer models in India, though with delays. The iPhone 13 arrived 6 to 9 months late, but by 2022, iPhone 14 was made in India in just 2 weeks after launch. Now, these delays were mostly because India still had a long way to get to where it is today. And that is because making high-end electronics from scratch is not at all easy. It takes years of immense amount of expertise, skilled workforce, and massive investments. India had no manufacturing base to speak of, and all of this was happening for the first time. Foxconn, which is Apple's contract manufacturer, had to bring in Chinese engineers to train the Indian workers, and this was not a walk in the park for sure. There were cultural differences, communication gaps, and just a different way of working that Indians didn't know, which slowed things down quite a bit. It took time, but year by year, things started getting better, and we got a hang of it. As a result, last year the iPhone 15 launched simultaneously from India and China. Though India made units initially sold locally, it reached global markets a few days late. Now with the iPhone 16, things are very different. Indian-made devices will be available globally just days after the retail launch. And that's not it. India will also be producing the Pro and Pro Max model for the very first time. These are premium models that require more specialized production capabilities. And this shows Apple is slowly gaining confidence in India's manufacturing capabilities. Now, this is a huge win for India considering we had subpar manufacturing capabilities for very, very long. With Indian-made iPhones set for export, it will send a very powerful signal for other companies to also think about relocating a part of their manufacturing capability to India. But the most exciting part in all of this story is what all of this means to the local Indian ecosystem. See, as India is proving to be a reliable producer, Apple may also want the suppliers of its iPhone components to come to India and set up their shop. According to Bloomberg, 14 out of 17 Chinese iPhone component suppliers have received initial clearance to operate in India, but they must partner with Indian firms to set up joint ventures as they cannot operate independently. And in case these foreign suppliers hesitate, Apple might turn to Indian companies themselves to fill in the gap, which could speed up the growth of domestic businesses as well. In fact, Financial Express just recently reported that Apple is already in talks with the Tata Group and other semiconductor manufacturers, and they are negotiating deals worth 12 billion US dollars for iPhone components made in India. Who knows, if things go well, Apple could expand manufacturing for Macs, AirPods, or even Apple Watches to India, which could mean even more business for the country and its companies. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I hope you found value in this episode. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care and goodbye.